37% of Aussies aged 14 or older have smoked cannabis at least once. That's 7.4 million Australians. With numbers like that, you'd think weed would be legal, or at least on track to being legalized, but the harsh reality is, it isn't, at least not recreationally. In Canberra, it's decriminalised. You can have up to 50 grams of dry cannabis, 150 grams of wet cannabis, or grow up to 2 plants, but it still isn't actually legal. Despite this, younger generations are increasingly moving away from alcohol and electing to smoke instead. There are politicians who openly talk about or make allusions to their own use of cannabis, and we also have the legalized cannabis party, who are slowly becoming something more than a donkey vote. Which leads us to an obvious question. Why won't Australia just legalize the use of cannabis? Cannabis had decent success in the medical space. In 2016, Australia passed laws allowing medical cannabis to be used for those with painful and chronic illnesses. Around 700,000 Australians use cannabis for medical purposes, and roughly 1/3 or 200,000 of those use it only for medical purposes. However, 70% of those who use medical cannabis exclusively for medical purposes do so without a prescription. And why is that? It's not always the easiest prescription to get. There is still a lot of stigma within the medical field about the validity of prescribing cannabis. Some doctors just don't want to do it. Doctors can be fearful of being perceived by colleagues as acting inappropriately. One, because some experts believe the data isn't there. And two, some doctors receive kickbacks from pushing certain cannabis brands and won't prescribe unless there's an economic incentive. Doctors don't want to be lumped into that category. And look, out of 640 GPs surveyed, 61.5 had been asked about medical cannabis, and more than half of them were supportive, but fewer than 1 in 10 knew how to navigate actually prescribing the drug. And that's really unfortunate when patients report significant improvements to their quality of life using medical cannabis. It's not always appropriate, but medical cannabis can also be used instead of opiates in some cases, and patients feel safer using herbs or oil compared to prescription painkillers. However, more research is needed. It can give people back control of their lives, allowing them to work or function again. Here's a weird fact of the matter though, it sure as hell doesn't give you the freedom to drive. We have something known as a roadside drug test, and it can detect drugs in your system like cannabis by detecting THC. Don't get me wrong, we want to stop people driving under the influence. It's not controversial to say people shouldn't be driving stoned, but these tests can detect cannabis in someone's system for up to 12 hours. Wait, sorry? I mean 12 to 30 hours. Wait, hold up again. I mean 72 hours. Wait, up to a week? I'm not saying roadside drug tests aren't important. Driving under the influence can be fatal, not just to you, but someone else. And data suggests that in 13.1% of all road fatalities, cannabis was present. With that said, however, it doesn't make sense that under our current system, the same RDT that catches the person high behind the wheel could also catch someone who smoked a joint on the Friday and gets RDT'd on the Monday. And for those out there who are staunchly against the illegal use of cannabis but fine with medical use, you might think this only applies if you're using it without a prescription. But you'd actually be wrong. In New South Wales, for instance, it's illegal to drive with THC in your system, full stop. Now, to be clear, not all medical cannabis has THC. There's also CBD products. But if we look at anxiety prescription data as an example, only 17% were CBD prescriptions, with THC liquid products being used 33% of the time and herbal cannabis 50% of the time. In regards to chronic pain, evidence is suggesting that a combination of THC and CBD is best, meaning people are being forced to decide whether to risk the RDT or be in pain. And again, around 70% of those using it for medical reasons exclusively don't have the formal prescription anyway. If the test comes back positive, you can be criminally charged. For a first offense, you can be fined up to $1,100 and be disqualified from driving for 3 to 6 months. If it happens a second time, it's a max of $2,200 and a disqualification from driving anywhere between 6 months and however long the judge decides. Again, this isn't just for recreational use. This is also for the person suffering with chronic pain. In Victoria, legalised cannabis recently secured a huge win, getting an amendment through that meant Victorians with a prescription won't automatically lose their licence for testing positive. I'd celebrate it if it wasn't for the fact that this should have been the bare minimum. Again, I am not saying I want people to be allowed to drive stoned out of their mind, but I don't like the reality that people are inhibited from getting to work or functioning without pain because of flaws in the legal system. Different countries countries have different methods of measuring cannabis influence, with a lot of countries electing to use blood tests rather than saliva tests. A task force in California stated THC or THC metabolites in the bloodstream did not correlate with whether or not a driver is actually impaired and recommended a threshold of 5 nanograms or more of THC per milliliter of whole blood, with Canada setting its cutoff at 2 nanograms. What that roughly means is you can drive 2 to 4 hours after smoking or about 8 hours after eating an edible. Personally, I think that's too soon, but it raises an important point. How do we successfully differentiate between the person high behind the wheel and the person with residual THC from the night before? They shouldn't be treated the same, and I don't necessarily know what that looks like in practice, but it sure isn't what's happening now. Another sad reality of cannabis criminalization is that cannabis is also a huge economic opportunity. In the US, it's expected to be a market volume of nearly $50 billion by 2029. Even with Australia's minimal access to cannabis, Aussies spent $234 million in 2022, $448 million in 2023, and $402 million in the first half of 2024. David Shoebridge, the leader of the New South Wales Greens, thinks there's an opportunity to make billions through tax. Parliamentary budget office figures requested by the Greens estimated $28 to $38 billion could be generated over a decade. Now, analysis from the University of Queensland disputes these figures, however, still estimated the revenue of $13 billion. That's not to say collecting revenue will be simple. There's complications with the legal market, mainly with price. Legalized cannabis comes with tax, something that current purchasers and sellers don't have to deal with. Legal cannabis needs to be competitive. Sure, some will pay the added cost for convenience, better quality and control, and greater access to different cannabis products, but an ounce of legalized cannabis could cost up to $474. That's $100 to $150 more than you might be paying if you bought it from that guy you met at a party one time. There's also amazing opportunities when it comes to jobs. In the United States, there are 440,455 full-time equivalent jobs supported by legal cannabis. There's also the economic boom that comes with cannabis tourism. Let's not ignore the elephant in the room though. There's economic costs that come with cannabis use too. There was an estimated cost of $4.5 billion across Australia in 2015 and 2016, but looking into specifics is really important. $2.4 billion of that cost is crime, with $1.6 billion of that spent on imprisonment and the police. However, only around $159 million of that is for violent crime related to cannabis. Now, that's not me ignoring the hundreds of millions that are spent on personal and household crimes, or the hundreds more that's spent on the courts, legal aid, and community correction, but not all cannabis cases in the system are violent, and we could be saving a lot of time and money with legalization. I'm not saying a legalized market would eliminate crime, and I'm not going to pretend there aren't dangerous criminals involved in the production of cannabis, but with legalization, we would likely see the costs go down as police didn't have to waste their time on non-violent cannabis crime or raiding grow houses that could be used to produce legal cannabis, instead focusing on the violent offenders. Look, that still leaves $2.1 billion in costs due to premature death, healthcare costs, workplace costs, road traffic accidents, and additional costs, but a fair amount of those categories fall into what I would call not good, but adults can make their own choices. I think one difficulty in legalizing cannabis is in part due to our aging population and the fact that politicians try to appeal to the majority, and older Aussies tend to be anti-legalization. Ironically, however, older adults are actually one of the fastest growing populations to try cannabis, and not just medically. I'm also talking about recreationally. Australia is also a nanny state and hates risk. As much as we like to paint ourselves as these carefree larrikins, we're not. We ban social media for kids under 16, we have some of the highest taxes in the world for tobacco and alcohol, we try to control elements of what can be said online, and overall, we're a strict nation. I don't inherently think that's a bad thing. I don't entirely disagree with any of the policies I've just mentioned, but as we move forward, it's important to keep in mind that we're a relatively socially conservative nation. Drugs are taboo, and no mainstream politician wants to touch the topic with a 10-foot pole, but we need to. I admit, It's not all sunshine and rainbows. There are real issues that come with declining mental health and cannabis interacting with one another. However, the same can be said about alcohol and cigarettes, yet those are legalized. Australia is sometimes referred to as the United States little brother, being 5 to 10 years behind the trends. This doesn't need to be another one of those moments. Legalize it. It'll be safer, bring in tax revenue, and create jobs and opportunities. It'll happen eventually. Let's not wait any longer. But hey, come let me know what you think in the comments. Come join the Discord, come talk about it, come say hi. It's been real.